Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where we talk about topics from history, and we each try to find something that the other does not know about. So my name is Ivor Kovac, and my partner is Stilgar, and today it is my turn to pick the topic and try to find something that Stilgar hasn't heard about before. So I have to ask, have you heard of Saint Brendan the Navigator?
I have not. No.
Actually, you have, but I was
Okay.
counting on you to forget.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mentioned him in that video I did about what happens in, after Lord of the Rings.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you forgot, which is
Yeah.
fine because I mentioned like a lot of stuff in there, and I figured there's a 90% chance that you wouldn't remember. So, okay, so
He's the one that supposedly discovered where the elves live, or is that the one?
no,
No.
not well. Okay, so yeah, well, it's sort of. No, that you're thinking of elf wine, but okay, sort of. But we'll
Yes,
get to
I was thinking of
I'll
elf wine.
mention.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll mention that later, like how it ties in with Tolkien. So, so you don't know anything about Saint Brendan the Navigator, then, right?
No, how do you spell? How do you spell his first name?
Brendan.
No. Okay.
Very
So, no.
very
Okay.
common Irish name. Um, okay, so the source, the original source for the Voyage of Saint Brendan was a medieval story called Navigatio Brendani. So
Mm-hmm.
originally it was written in Latin, and Saint Brendan supposedly lived in the 6th century AD.
Yeah.
So that'd be like the year 500, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thereabouts. Yeah, I always get a little messed up when it's like the year 500, but you call it like the next century. It's kind of
6th century, so somewhere between the year 500 and 599, I guess. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but it's in the 10th century that the book is written, the Navigatio Brendani, but the
Mm-hmm.
actual guy, he lived in the 6th century. So they, and one thing he did do is he founded churches around Ireland, but I don't know like how much of what is attributed to him actually happened. So he may have actually gone on a sea voyage, but I very much doubt that all these things, that are mentioned in the book actually happened. But by now, people are probably getting mad at me because I haven't said what actually happened yet. So,
Okay. So what
um,
happened?
okay. So according to the story, Saint Brendan is visited by some monks or priests, and they tell him that they voyaged out into the west and they found an island of paradise where there's like big, huge fruits growing everywhere on the trees. So there's like an abundance of food, and there's great jewels and gemstones on the ground,
Just laying around.
just laying around. There's no people that are living there. It's like the island. It's an island of paradise, the
Oh yeah.
blessed land.
Yeah.
And so Saint Brendan, he sets out to discover it, and that's where this story comes in. And on his way, he goes to a few different islands. Um, so, like, let me see here. There's three guys that join that are extra guys that join his voyage at the last minute, and two of those guys die. I can't remember what happens to the third one, but I should have remembered that. But I read this like months ago. So they set out trying to reach this paradise on Earth, and they visit a few different islands. And there's one island they visit where there's these monks that have set up a monastery there, and they've achieved immortality. And all they do is, pray and worship there. And Saint Brendan wants to stay there, but they're like, no, you have to keep going. So he also goes to this other island called the Paradise of Birds, where there's a tree in this island, like a big tree, and it's covered in white fluff, or at least that's how it appears in the distance. And it turns out that it's covered totally in these birds. And Saint Brendan is like, oh, what is this mystery? I don't understand. He prays to God. He says, can you explain this to me? And one of the birds flies over, and what he tells Saint Brendan is that they were spirits that lived in heaven, and through no fault of their own, they were cast out of heaven. Like when Satan and his angels rebelled, they didn't take Satan's side, but they fell along with him. I think it was because they didn't pick any side, but they were just cast out of heaven. Not because they did wrong, but because they didn't do good. And they were, and then God, he allows them to assemble on this island where they take the form of birds. And there's actually another Irish folk story that I read once where they mention like I think some type of demi-humans. I can't remember whether they were fae, like fairies, or what's the other thing? They were some other type of life form that were basically from older Irish mythology, but they were rewritten. After Catholicism came, they were framed as like beings that were in heaven that were responsible for watching the gates, and they just kind of sat on there, like they didn't do anything when the war was going on between God and his angels, so they were thrown down to earth for the crime of being neutral, and they became like fairies and stuff. But that's a different story, actually. But that's kind of the same thing happens here. So that's the Paradise of Birds, and there's like a few different islands that he goes to. There's one where they have huge grapes that are like the size of tennis balls or volleyballs, something like that. And there's another place where there's a great column sticking up out of the ocean, and then this kind of canopy coming down from it. And there's another island they stop at where there's all kinds of men at work in smithies, forges, and the sound of their hammers is like echoing out onto the ocean. And as they pass near this island, the guys, the smiths, they see them and they start throwing like metal and slag at them. And there's another island where they meet this old hermit who is wearing nothing at all, no clothes. And he's a holy hermit where he gets everything that he needs. And eventually they do reach, well, before they reach that, there's a couple other points of interest. Like one is they reach this great mountain just sticking up out of the ocean, and the top is like a flame. And this mountain is actually a gateway to hell. And one of the priests that joined them, which Brendan didn't invite, this is the place where he gets off, and he's compelled to get off the boat. And he gets to this mountain, and the demons come out, and they grab him, and they take him to hell. And then a little ways out into the ocean, they find Judas sitting on, I think it's a rock. Yeah, he's sitting on a rock out in the ocean. And they say that for a limited time, he's allowed to have some reprieve from hell and sit out on the ocean. And I have some excerpts that I wanted to read from this book. So, okay. So here's the place with the birds, the island of birds. And some of these islands he goes to multiple times. Like he comes back to them and he has feast days and stuff on these islands. So, okay. Let's see, where do I start here? Okay. Then the saint, realizing that his prayer had been granted, said to the bird, "If you are a messenger from God, tell me where all these birds come from, and why they are gathered together here." The bird answered, "We are victims of the ancient enemy. Through no fault of our own, we fell from heaven with Lucifer and his followers. But God, who always dispenses justice, sent us to this place, where we suffer no pain, and where we can see a little of the divine presence. But we must be kept apart from the angels who remained faithful to God. We wander the world in the air and earth and sky, like the other spirits on their missions. But on festival days, we take the shapes you see and come here and sing the praises of the Creator. You and your brothers have now been on your voyage for 1 year, and you will journey for another 6 years. Every year you will celebrate Easter, where you celebrated it this year, until you find what your hearts long for, the land of the promise of the saints. So they come back to this island a few times. And let's see here. Yeah, eventually they do get to the island of Paradise, where there's the fruit trees and the jewels on the ground, and they take a bunch of the jewels back with them. What else do I have here? Yeah, so the land, the island of Paradise, there's always light there. It never gets dark. And then the island is divided in two by a river, and they're not allowed to cross the river. So it says here, when St. Brendan asked whether this land would ever be made known to men, the young man replied, when the Most High Creator rules all the nations, this land will be made known to his chosen people. And after this, Brendan finishes his work here, and he goes back. And I forgot to mention Jasconius. So there's one part of the story, like as they're going out through the ocean, they're finding different islands to stop on. There's one island that they stop on where there's nothing growing on it. And the guys, they make a fire, and they set this pot over the fire. And then all of a sudden, the island, starts moving away. And so they run back to the boat, and it turns out that the island is the great fish Jasconius, who is the largest fish in the sea. And they visit Jasconius a few more times to make camp there as they go. And the next time they see Jasconius, the fire is still burning on his back and the pot is still there. So it's weird because in the story it says that the heat of the fire causes him to start moving, but yet the fire is still there, when next they meet. So there's a lot of kind of, I guess you could say, it does have a fairly mystical feel to it. The story does. And as for the way sea creatures figure prominently. So there's another part that's kind of interesting, because after he goes back to Ireland, it talks about his life there and how he's traveling around and founding churches and bringing in more people to the order. And there's one incident here. Let's see. This is kind of cool. So on one day when Brendan was on his voyages on the ocean, he saw two monsters of the deep in dreadful conflict, one of them chasing the other with great fury. When the monster that was being chased was about to be overtaken and killed by the other monster, it cried out in a human voice, "I commend myself to the protection of St. Patrick, the chief bishop of the Irish." The other monster then shouted, "His protection won't help you now." Then the first monster cried out, "I commend myself to the protection of St. Brendan here." And then his pursuer said, "Neither will his protection save you now." At last the first monster cried out, "I commend myself to the protection of the most holy Virgin Bridget." At that the monster in pursuit withdrew straight away, saying that it dare not chase another monster that had asked for the protection of Bridget. In this way the wretched creature escaped unharmed. After that, Brendan composed a hymn in praise of St. Bridget for the greater glory of God, and when he returned to Ireland, he went to visit that saint. He told her about the monsters and asked her why such monsters of the deep had more fear of her than of other saints. The Holy Virgin replied with a question, "How often do you fix your attention on God?" Brendan answered, "At every seventh step I take, or sooner, I have God in my thoughts, but sometimes I think of God alone for a long space of time." Then Bridget said, "So sometimes you think about worldly things, and at other times you think about God. For my part, since I first applied my mind to God, I have never for a moment thought of anything but Him. The more constantly you fix your attention, fix the attention of your mind and the love of your heart on God, the more the animals will be afraid of you." Brendan was deeply affected by Bridget's words, and having received her blessing and giving his blessing in return, he went on his way. What do you think of that? Have you ever heard anything like that before?
No, but I think it's a cool story. That's for sure. I like it. I don't know
Yeah,
this Saint Bridget at all, but I like that. I like that conversation they had, and actually some wisdom in there, right? Too. I like it. It's cool. The big fish made me think of like fantasy, fantasy movies or games. Like you have the big turtle in Never-Ending Story. Although people didn't really travel on him in Golden Axe, the video game. At one point, I think there's a turtle you travel on. Like it's an island, but it turns out to be a turtle. Um, yeah. What else do I think about it? I think it's cool.
yeah, it's very medieval. I've read a few other medieval things, other medieval literature before,
Hmm.
and if you look at the medieval artwork, it's kind of interesting the way they show sea creatures. Like, for one, it's highly inaccurate, but a lot of them they have faces kind of like dogs. Like they'll
Yeah.
put nostrils and things on them,
Yep.
um, and so they had no idea what's out there, even up into the 1800s. Like if you look at Gustave Doré, who's one of my favorite artists, he did this illustration called "The Creation of Fish and Birds," and he had these kind of medieval-looking monsters, but he did it in a realistic art style. So it's kind of, but um, my absolute favorite author is Tolkien.
Hmm.
And well, before I say I'm going to get back to that, but one of the things I found out is this type of story is called it's Imrama. It's an Irish story about voyage at the sea. And there is an older story than this, which I haven't read, called the story of Mael Duin. Probably messing up the pronunciation, but maybe that might make another topic. But it's another story about a guy that voyages at sea, and there's something about this, and this is probably what got Tolkien's attention. You remember the video I did about the medieval mythology, like my
Yeah.
first video?
Hmm.
Like in the medieval times, they put they believed there was an earthly paradise, but they always put it in the far east, like further east than India. Like India was often the easternmost country that they knew existed. And if you look at the Mappy Mundis from the Middle Ages, it's oriented from from east to west, with east at the top, west at the bottom.
And
And
Jerusalem in the middle, right?
right, yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And if you see like the medieval kings holding those balls in their hand, it's got like a stripe or a bulge going around the middle, and then it's got another thing going over the top. And what the ball meant is it was their way of depicting the world. It was a globe, and it was showing uh, the land masses, the three land masses. So you have Europe, Africa, and Asia, and Asia is the biggest one. And the stripe around the middle, it symbolizes like the Mediterranean, and then the one, let me think, is that right? The shorter stripe, one stripe symbolizes like the T intersection is the intersection of the Mediterranean
I
with
think
the
so.
Eastern Sea, like the Red Sea and the Caspian. They thought that's what divided the world up. And then
Hmm.
at the very far east would be the paradise of earth, which is usually the Garden of Eden and they might show it being encircled by some kind of fence. So what's interesting about the Voyage of St. Brendan is that he goes looking for the earthly paradise in the West. You get it?
Yeah.
So Tolkien, his whole thing is his earthly paradise is in the West. So this story kind of went along with his own mythology that he was developing, which is why he originally had plans to include it. And so in that video I did about Tolkien and what happens after the Middle Earth, that stuff that I read was not from this book. It was stuff that he read. Like he wrote a poem where St. Brendan is recalling things that he missed before. So the Paradise of Birds is actually an encounter with elves and something like that. He hears the voices of elves while he's there. And the great flaming mountain that's like sticking up straight from the sea is almost taken exactly from the original St. Brendan story, except the implication in Tolkien's depiction is that it's not a gateway to hell, but it's Minaltarma, which was the highest point of Numenor before it sank.
Mm-hmm.
And so, while we're on this topic of inspiration, I think that C.S. Lewis also borrowed from this a bit, because there's a book that have you read any of the Chronicles of Narnia, or maybe are you a fan of Lewis?
I've seen the movies. My wife has read all the books. I found them to be a little bit too dry for my liking, but I may need to give them another chance. I think so.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
like C.S. Lewis's thought process. His thought process is actually kind of similar to mine. But there's a story in the Chronicles of Narnia. There's one story called "The Voyage of the Dawn Treader," where they set out into in their world, they're going into the east to explore and find out what's on the other side of the ocean. So it's a mission of exploration, and they reach a point where the ocean is so clear that you can see all the way to the bottom of it. And there's something like that in St. Brendan as well, where so here it says, let's see.
It doesn't matter whether they went west or east, though, because they knew the Earth was round, even in medieval times. Because there's a common misconception that they thought the Earth was flat, which is actually not true. It's a myth.
Yeah, the Nordic people with the concept of the world tree and the world of Midgard was conceived as a flat world, but the medieval world knew that it was round because of the
Ancient Greeks. Yeah.
Romans and the Ptolemaic worldview. Like, but at any rate,
Yeah.
no, I mean, like the thing is that makes St. Brendan different is that he's looking for the earthly paradise in the West, whereas according to the medieval view that was common during this time, it was in the East. So the story is kind of a break from the general view, the general prevailing view of the time.
Okay. But they weren't trying to get to the east by sailing around the world. That wasn't.
No, he wasn't trying to go all the way around the world. He was trying to find the Isle of Paradise, where, let me see, I think where is it? I'll read you if I can. I didn't mark this one, unfortunately, but let's see, where is it that he describes? No, that's not it. That's talking about Jasconius. Okay, here. My dear son Murnoch, who was the almoner at our monastery, left us to become a hermit. He found an island near the Stone Mountain. It was an island full of delights. After a while, I learned that he was the leader of many monks who lived there. No, that's not the island either, actually. Okay. So I can't find it now, but yeah, basically it's. Oh no, here it is, right here. Okay, so that they find it, and it's surrounded by the island of delights. The earthly paradise is surrounded by a fog, that you can't see the island from the outside, and you have to go through the fog before you can get it. Okay, here. When the boat touched the shore, we got out, and then we explored the island for 15 days, but there was always more to see. All the plants there had flowers on them, all the trees had fruit, and every stone was a precious gem. On the 15th day, we discovered a river flowing from west to east. We didn't know how to cross the river, so we waited for advice from God. While we were waiting, a man suddenly appeared in front of us. He was shining with a bright light, and he called us by our names. And said, "Welcome, worthy brothers, for the Lord has revealed to you the land he will give to his saints. This river divides the land in two, and you are not permitted to cross it. You must go back where you came from." So these are the guys that are giving St. Brendan the message, that are letting him know where the island is. And it is surrounded by a fog. Let's see, we were under sail. Dense clouds surrounded us so we could hardly see the prow or stern of the boat. After an hour or so, a bright light shone all around us, and we saw land. The island was big and grassy, and there were all sorts of fruits growing there. So there's another part in this story where, he sees all the way to the bottom of the ocean. So in that Voyage of the Dawn Treader story, there's an island that's completely surrounded by darkness, so that you can't see it from a distance. You just see the darkness. But it's not hiding a paradise like this. It's hiding like a monster nightmare place, like a literal nightmare place, where your nightmares are made physical. And then also, as they get near the end of the world of Narnia, the ocean becomes utterly transparent. You can see all the way to the bottom, all the sea creatures and everything. So, one thing about like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien is a lot of people look back to them as a source of inspiration, and seeing them as creative geniuses, and I see them as creative geniuses. But the stuff that they look back to was stuff like this: the Voyage of St. Brendan, and the Odyssey and the Iliad, and what's that other one called? The Kalevala, I think is what it's called. It's like a Finnish mythology.
Okay.
So, yeah. So, I mean, that's all I had on this. I thought it was a cool story.
It's an interesting story. I like it. I like to, it definitely has a Greek mythology feel to it as well. So yeah, cool story. I guess later on, they stopped looking for paradise, and then they started looking for El Dorado in the West, right? But that's a different story altogether.
Well, there was a lot of gold that the Amerindian civilizations had. Like, I think we talked about this in another video. The Amerindian civilizations, like the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayas, they didn't make metal weapons or tools, but they did make all sorts of stuff out of gold. So, the whole thing is, the main purpose of the Spanish exploration was to kind of dig the gold and come back to Spain and get rich. And they actually ended up bringing back so much gold that they wrecked their economy. But that's another topic, that's another story.
Also.
But this thing, I saw, when I was looking around on the internet for pictures to go with this video, and there have been different attempts made to kind of map where St. Brendan went. And there's some speculation in the introduction here that the editor wrote, or the translator at the beginning of my version of this book, where they're kind of like, well, where did Brendan actually go? And maybe the crystal pillar with a sheet coming down from it was actually an iceberg, and maybe the island of blacksmiths where they're throwing bits of slag and metal at him was actually a volcano.
Yeah.
And it could be, but like, if the guy lived in the 6th century, and it's not until 500 years later that somebody is putting it down on paper, then what are you actually putting down on paper? You're probably doing like some oral tradition that's been badly garbled with time.
Yeah, maybe bards have been singing the
Yeah,
story for for centuries. Could be. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it could be distorted, and supposedly there've been, I mean, there have been attempts to try and say, well, maybe he went to Iceland and Newfoundland, and oh, maybe these islands are here. But I think these islands, do not exist in our world. It might be kind of fun to write like a modern version of this story where Saint Brendan really did go to see these things, but it was actually because he went through a portal, a wormhole out on the ocean, came out in some other world.
The Bermuda Triangle, but in the West. Yeah.
Yeah, like a wormhole that temporary opens up to another world. Actually, C.S. Lewis, he used that method in some of his stories. Like there were people that made it into Narnia by accident, like sailors. They found a portal that to open to another universe, and they went through it without knowing what they were doing, and they ended up there. And
that has also been reused in stories since. Yeah. Trying
yeah,
to think. Yeah. What was the story where they went back in time and it was like a back to the time when dinosaurs were around and then their Earth was dying and anyway, yeah, it's been used for sure. Yeah.
yeah, I know what you're talking about. I saw the advertisements for it, but I never
Actually, it
watched
was a
it.
pretty interesting show, but there's also like all these ships and stuff. But they only did like 1 or 2 seasons. So yeah. Anyway, I like the idea of going back to like 65 million years and humans facing off to dinosaurs. How would they survive or not? Anyway,
Well, there are actually all sorts of depictions of creatures in the ancient world that do look a lot like dinosaurs. Like you have depictions of things on the Ishtar Gate of Babylon, and then you have this place in Mexico, Acamburo, where they've dug up all sorts of figurines, of different creatures that look like dinosaurs, sauropod type dinosaurs, things with long necks and long tails. And then in Africa, where there's that great tropical jungle, you have natives like people have gone to the native scientists and they've said stuff like they've showed them pictures of dinosaurs, drawings, and for some of them, the natives have their own local names. Like there's this book that I read called In Search of a Living Dinosaur, where these two scientists, the main guy, the leader of the expedition, his name was Roy McCall, and they went to go look for this creature called the Mokele Mbimbi, which the native people describe as a sauropod type dinosaur with yellow skin.
mm-hmm.
And they showed them pictures of other dinosaurs because at first they thought maybe they had this suspicion like these natives are pranking us, they're just trying to tell us what we want to hear. So then they showed them like pictures of all the dinosaurs, and for a lot of them they're like, no, I don't know what that is. But then for some of them they had native names. So it's entirely possible that there's still dinosaurs holding out in some part of the world. Of course, when it comes to a lot of the creatures from the Middle Ages, the blimmies, right? That thing with just it's got like no head and a face on the chest. And apparently, there was an actual tribe of people called the Blimmies that lived to the south of Egypt. So the Romans, they knew about the real people, the Blimmies, but they didn't know much about them. It was just another barbaric tribe on the frontier.
Mm-hmm.
However, the name was passed down onto the Middle Ages and somehow became this monster. And it's interesting because some of the stuff you can tell is based off of legends that were distorted, especially with the kind of monsters that they believed lived in Africa. Like there was something called I think it's called a panotee, and it had these big, long, flappy ears, kind of like Dumbo. And they portrayed it as like a humanoid with, Caucasoid features and light, color, almost colorless skin, but these big, huge ears. Well, it turns out that there are tribes in Africa that stretch their ears, their earlobes long. So, you think about the Middle Ages. First, we had the Dark Ages, and then after that, Islam came and took over North Africa. So you had no chance of actually, if you're a European scholar, you have no chance to actually go down there into Africa. I mean, you can go, but we already talked about what was going to happen in your other video. If you try to if you try to go there, you're not going to come back. So there's no way to really investigate until later, and a lot of the monsters were just distorted things. But it is interesting, like
I like where the imagination takes people. So it's
yeah,
yeah.
because you think about, like, if you're a medieval dude and you want to tell a story about a strange world, a voyage to going to alien. Your version of that would be something like the Voyage of Saint Brendan, where you go to other islands, or there's another book I have which I barely started reading. It's called The Travels of John Mandeville, where this guy supposedly travels all over the world, and he's going to tell you about what's in other parts of the world. So, like, one of the things he says is in India, he writes this whole chapter about how there's this ice up in the mountains that hardens into actual diamonds. And I was just like, yeah, you've never actually been to India, but back then they didn't know that. So yeah, I need to read that book too. Um, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
just
man,
interesting.
it's an interesting world, and there's so many parallels to Greek mythology. Yeah,
So
yeah.
the world having been explored now, like the alien creatures, in the medieval world, if you want to write a story about alien creatures, you're just going to the frontiers, like a more remote place of Earth. And then in the 20th century, you want to write about alien creatures and adventures, it's like going to be Mars, Venus, Jupiter, like the John Carter stories and things, Edgar
Hmm.
Rice Burroughs. And now that we know that our solar system is basically dead apart from our Earth, if you want to write a plausible story about aliens, you have to go outside. So as our physical frontier gets pushed back, that our knowledge, the frontier of our knowledge, so does the fantastic frontier, like the setting for stories and strange new adventures.
True, true. Although, I mean, technically, like planets like Neptune or Jupiter, I don't know. I mean, there might still be there's still the potential there, right? But it would just be different than like people living on Mars. The life forms would have to be completely different.
And maybe like
Um,
an energy-based life form, like that thing that possesses Jean-Luc Picard in
Yeah,
one
or maybe some kind of giant whale swimming through the the gas clouds of Jupiter or something like that, right? So it would
It
have to be.
couldn't be a carbon-based life form because it would have to be made out of elements that are have a different freezing point, right? In order to be there. Well, I guess Jupiter is pretty hot towards the interior, isn't it?
Yeah, it gets really hot. The deeper down you go, but yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. You're right. Then you need faster than light travel, and all those things. So
Yep.
yeah. All right, man. It was a cool story. I appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah.
Great.
If anybody else knows any interesting stories, maybe from other cultures about exploring, I wonder if there's any Chinese stories about exploring the West and the crazy things happening there.
There actually, yeah, I do want to get into Chinese literature, but there's actually a book that I have. I started reading it and I never finished it, but it's by a guy named Gavin Menzies. And he did some research, and there's some evidence to indicate that the Chinese actually sent an expeditionary fleet to America and contacted the natives here before Christopher Columbus. Of
Mm,
course, the
mm.
Vikings still would have gotten here before the Chinese, but
Yeah, the
yeah, I mean,
Vikings got there, but still, they didn't really do much after, right? They were either killed or, assimilated into the population.
I think the Amerindians killed the men and carried off the women.
Yeah. And then maybe I can give. Have you ever read Gulliver's Travels?
No, I watched a movie about it, a movie like a made-for-TV movie of it. back in middle school, but I never read the book.
All right, maybe it's freely available again also on Gutenberg. So if anybody is interested, maybe you could put the link in there. And it's also interesting to see how they interacted with the natives and basically trying not to get eaten. But anyway, it's also a fantasy story, right? So, but yeah, definitely. If there are any other topics anybody else would like to have us discuss, like we're doing this for the fun of it. So, if you have something that you find interesting, let us know because we'd love to dive into it and learn things ourselves because that's what this channel is all about. Learning from.
Put
Yeah.
any requests in the comment section, and at this stage, we're quite likely to take it up.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much awesome history out there, and really, we are the armchair historians. We don't know all of it, so yeah, we appreciate it, and we also appreciate it if you want to share this episode, if you can like it, any feedback, much appreciated. Yeah, other than that, really thank you for your time, and thanks for this story, Ivor. Yeah.
Thanks, and thank you for watching, whoever is watching.
All right.